He told her the guest room would be more comfortable, that it would be easier for both of them.
She didn't argue.
She picked up her pillow, walked down the hall, and closed the door behind her. That was 7 months ago. And for 7 months, Darnell Mason heard nothing from that room that bothered him. No crying, no knocking, no soft voice outside his office door asking if he'd eaten. Just silence. He told himself that was exactly what he wanted. Then one night, something came through the wall. Laughter. Not polite laughter. Not the kind a woman performs when she's trying to keep the peace. This was loud and real and completely unguarded. The kind that only happens when someone has forgotten to manage themselves because they finally feel completely safe. Darnell put down his glass. He sat very still. He had been married to Sherry for 13 months. He had never heard her make that sound. Not once. Not in this penthouse. Not in this marriage. And she was making it for someone else. Before we continue, where are you watching this right now? Tell me your country in the comments. I want to know where these stories are reaching. And welcome to Lily's Afro-Korean Mafia Tales. Now, let's go back. 11 months before the guest room. Before the silence. Before Sherry learned to stop wanting things in this marriage. The first night she cooked for him, she made doenjang jjigae. She found the recipe on a Korean cooking forum, watched 3 YouTube videos, burned the first pot, started over, and got it right on the second try. She set it on the kitchen counter with a small bowl of rice and a folded napkin and a note that said, "I'm still learning. Let me know if it's close." Darnell came home at 10:47. He saw the food. He stood there for a moment, long enough that she would have counted it as something if she'd been watching. He picked up the note, read it, set it down, ate half the bowl standing at the counter, went to his office, didn't say anything. She found the half-empty bowl in the sink the next morning and told herself that was something. She kept trying. For months, she kept trying. She studied phrases in his dialect and used them at the wrong times, and he would correct her without looking up from whatever he was reading, not unkindly, just precisely, the way he did everything. She left his coffee outside his office door. On mornings, she knew his calls started before the city was awake. She sat across from him at dinner and asked real questions, not how was your day questions, but specific ones. About the men in his organization. About the cities he moved through. About what he was like before he became this version of himself. He answered sometimes. In the abbreviated, controlled way, he answered everything. Like every sentence was already costing him something he had budgeted carefully. She told herself he was getting better, that she was getting through. She was wrong. The night everything became irreversible started over nothing. That's the part that still doesn't sit right. Not a betrayal. Not a discovery. Just dinner. A comment she made about one of his lieutenants that landed wrong. His response came out harder than he probably intended.
Her response to that.
And suddenly, they were somewhere neither of them had planned to be, in the middle of a real fight with real words and real weight behind every one of them. She cried. She didn't mean to. She wasn't performing it. She was just exhausted, and it spilled. Darnell went completely still. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they don't have a category for. Like she had introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for and didn't know where to file. Then he set down his fork, looked at her with that flat, even gaze, not cruel, just sealed, and said, very calmly, very quietly, that she would probably be more comfortable in the guest room. That her emotional state was disrupting the evening. That it would be better for both of them. She stared at him. He held eye contact. Not angry, just waiting. Like the conversation was already finished, and she was the only one who hadn't accepted it yet. She got up. She got her pillow. She walked down the hall. The door closed. And that was that. The guest room had good morning light, and a window that looked out over the Atlanta skyline. Sherry put her books on the sill. She brought in the candle she'd been keeping in a drawer since they moved in, the one she never felt comfortable lighting anywhere else in his apartment. She ordered a burnt orange velvet chair online and assembled it herself on the floor in her good clothes because she refused to wait for anyone to help her. Within 2 weeks, the room was hers. Not in a resigned way. In the way a woman takes a space that was meant to diminish her and makes it mean something else entirely. She still tried for a while, quieter than before, but she tried. She made his coffee in the mornings and left the cup on the kitchen counter without a note. She sat in the living room some evenings, close enough to be visible, not close enough to require anything from him. She went to events on his arm when his world required it, fundraisers, dinners, the kind of rooms where powerful people perform liking each other. She was good at those rooms. She was warm and sharp and held conversations that made his associates glance at each other across the table the way people do when something genuinely impresses them. On the car rides home, he never mentioned it. She stopped making his coffee in February. Not as a statement. She just woke up one morning, stood in the kitchen, thought about it, and didn't. The next morning was easier. The one after that, she didn't think about it at all. She started filling her mornings differently. Long walks before the city got loud. Phone calls with her friend Denise in DC that went an hour, sometimes 2. Books she'd been meaning to read for years. A journal she wrote every night in the burnt orange chair with the candle going and the Atlanta skyline still outside the window. She was, and this part surprised even her, starting to feel like herself again. Not happy, exactly, but present inside her own life in a way she hadn't been since before her father died. Before the estate complications. Before the arrangement that had brought her to this man's apartment and this man's world. She hadn't planned what happened in March. She wasn't looking for anything. She went to a record shop in Midtown on a Saturday afternoon because she needed to be somewhere that didn't feel like a negotiation. She was in the jazz section. She had loved jazz since her father used to play Coltrane on Sunday mornings in whatever city they were living in that year, and she reached for an album at the exact moment someone else did. She looked up. He was tall and easy in his body, wearing a worn gray Henley, looking at the record in his hand like he was genuinely deciding something. He looked up at the same time. "My bad," he said. "You were there first." "I wasn't," she said. "You can have it." "What if I told you I've already heard it," he said, "and I was just reaching out of habit?" She looked at him. He smiled. Not a line. Just a person being honest. "Tobias Cole," he said, and held out his hand. "Sherry Mason," she said, and shook it. They stood in that aisle for 40 minutes. He knew things about jazz she didn't know. She knew things about Coltrane's personal history that surprised him. Neither of them ran out of something to say. He had a Memphis drawl that surfaced on certain words. He laughed right before the punchline of his own stories, which should have been annoying and wasn't. When she finally checked her phone, she was genuinely startled. "I've been here 40 minutes. "I know," he said. "I was aware of every one of them." She gave him her number before she decided if she should. He texted her the next morning. "Did you find anything good?" She smiled at her phone in the burnt orange chair. Then she put it face down because the smile felt like more than she was ready to look at directly. He texted her every morning after that. Nothing complicated. "How are you feeling? What are you reading? Did you eat?" Small, consistent questions that nobody had been asking her. She started answering them. Longer answers. Then real calls. Then calls that went past midnight, voices low, both of them talking the way people talk when they've forgotten to be careful. She told him about her father. About moving 14 times before she was 18. About the marriage, not everything, not the full shape of it, but enough. That it was cold. That she was lonelier inside it than she had ever been alone. Tobias listened. When she finished, he said, "You still got that laugh, though. I heard it in the record shop. I didn't laugh that much. You laughed plenty. You just did it like you were trying to keep it quiet." She didn't have anything to say to that. "Stop keeping it quiet," he said. And that night, for the first time in longer than she could name, she laughed in that guest room until her chest hurt. Like this story if you're already invested. drop a comment,
subscribe.
because what happens next, when Darnell Mason hears that laugh through the wall and goes completely still, changes everything. She found the recipe on a Korean cooking forum at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, sitting cross-legged on the bed in her phone's light while Darnell was still in his office, doing whatever Darnell did in his office until the small hours. She watched 3 tutorial videos back-to-back, took notes in the margin of a grocery receipt, and was at the store by 9 the next morning before the city got loud. She burned the first pot. Not badly, just enough that the bottom carried a bitterness she could taste when she tested it and knew immediately he would taste too. She didn't try to salvage it. She emptied it, rinsed it, started over, and got it right on the second try. She set it on the kitchen counter at 7 with a small bowl of rice beside it, a folded napkin, and a note in her handwriting that said, "I'm still learning. Let me know if it's close." Then she went to her side of the apartment and didn't wait up, because waiting felt like pressure, and she didn't want to put pressure on anything this early. She had learned that much about him already in 6 weeks of marriage, that Darnell Mason did not respond well to being watched. He came home at 10:30. She heard the door, heard the particular silence of a man moving through a space he fully owns, heard it go quiet in the kitchen for longer than it would take to simply pass through. She didn't get up. She stayed in bed with her book open to the same page she'd been on for an hour. He didn't come to the bedroom. In the morning, she found the bowl in the sink, half empty. The note was gone. She never found it in the trash or anywhere else, which meant he'd kept it or discarded it somewhere she couldn't see, and she decided not to think too hard about which one. She stood at the sink and looked at that bowl for a moment. The rice is finished. The broth is mostly gone. Evidence of a man who had stood at this counter in the dark and eaten something she had made for him.
She told herself that was something.
It was the version of him she was still learning to read, the man in the image she carried in her mind when she thought about who she had married. Precise in everything. The dark suit is always exact, the tie is always straight, the posture of someone who had decided long ago that how you occupy a room tells people everything they need to know before you open your mouth. Handsome in a way that was mostly unsettling. He looked at things, at rooms, at people, at her, with the calm, measuring attention of someone who was always 3 steps ahead and had stopped bothering to hide it. She was still learning how to be in the same space as a man like that without making herself smaller to fit. She washed the bowl. She made coffee. She kept trying. It started over nothing. That's the part that still doesn't sit right. Not a betrayal. Not a discovery. Not even an argument that had been building towards something inevitable. Just dinner. Just a Tuesday night with takeout containers on the counter because she hadn't cooked and he hadn't asked her to, and the Atlanta rain doing what Atlanta rain does in November, steady and indifferent against the penthouse windows. She made a comment about Weston, one of his lieutenants. She'd met him twice at organizational dinners, and both times he'd spoken past her to Darnell, the way certain men speak past wives like they are furniture that has learned to hold a handbag. She said something about it, not angrily, just observationally, the way she said most things, that Weston seemed like a man who had decided she wasn't worth directing a sentence to. Darnell's response came out harder than he probably intended. Something about how Weston's opinion of her was not relevant to anything, and neither, implied but not quite stated, was hers of him. She responded to that. And then they were somewhere neither of them had planned to be. The words had weight behind them, real weight, the kind that accumulates over months of swallowed things and half-empty bowls and car rides home where he never mentioned how well she'd held a room. It wasn't loud. That almost made it worse. 2 people speaking at a measured volume about things that had been sitting unaddressed long enough to grow edges.
She cried. She didn't mean to.
She wasn't performing it, and she wasn't trying to win anything with it. She was simply exhausted in a way that had been building since before she could name it, and it spilled over the way exhaustion eventually does regardless of how composed you've trained yourself to be. She pressed her fingers to the corner of her eye immediately, like she could take it back. Darnell went completely still. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they don't have a category for. Not disgusted. Not moved. Something in between that was worse than either, like she had introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for in any of his calculations and he genuinely did not know where to file it. The stillness lasted several seconds. Then he picked up his glass, set it down, and said, very calmly, very evenly, that she would probably be more comfortable in the guest room tonight. That her emotional state was disrupting the evening, that it would be better for both of them. She stared at him. He held eye contact. Not cruel, she would almost have preferred cruel. Just waiting. Patient and sealed and entirely unmoved, like the conversation was already concluded, and she was simply the last one to receive the information. She got up. She went to the bedroom and got her pillow. She walked down the hall.
The door closed.
And somewhere behind her, she heard him pick up his glass again. The guest room had good morning light. That was the first thing she noticed, not as consolation, just as fact. The window faced east, and the Atlanta skyline did something different at dawn than it did at any other hour. All that glass catching the light before the city had fully decided to be awake. She stood at the window the first morning and looked at it for a long time. Then she unpacked. She put her books on the sill in the order she intended to read them. She brought in the candle she'd been keeping in a bathroom drawer since they moved in. Bergamot and cedar, the kind of scent that made a room feel inhabited rather than occupied. She lit it that first night and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the flame and didn't think about anything in particular, which was its own kind of relief. The chair came 4 days later. Burnt orange velvet, deep-seated, the kind of chair that is a genuine decision rather than a piece of furniture. She assembled it herself on the floor in her good clothes because it arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and she was not going to wait for anyone to help her. And she was not going to change her clothes first, as though the chair required a lesser version of her. It took 40 minutes and one strip screw she had to finesse with a butter knife, and when it was done she sat in it immediately to confirm it held, and looked out at the skyline, and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't try to name. Within 2 weeks, the room was hers. Not in a resigned way. In the way a woman takes a space that was designed to diminish her and makes it mean something else entirely through sheer force of intention. She still tried for a while. Quieter than before, but she tried. She made his coffee in the mornings and left the cup on the kitchen counter without a note. No note felt like less exposure, like she was maintaining something without asking to be seen doing it. She sat in the living room some evenings, present but not demanding presence back, close enough to be visible, not close enough to require anything from him.
She went to his events.
Fundraisers, dinners, rooms full of careful people performing warmth at each other across linen tablecloths. She was good in those rooms. Warm and sharp and genuinely interested in people in a way that couldn't be faked, and his associates would glance at each other across tables in the small, surprised way of men who had underestimated something. On the car rides home, Darnell never mentioned it. She stopped making his coffee in February. Not as a statement. Not to make a point. She simply woke up one morning, stood in the kitchen, thought about it, and didn't. The next morning was easier. The one after that, she didn't think about it at all. She hadn't planned to go anywhere that Saturday. She'd woken up in the burnt orange chair with her journal open on her lap and the Atlanta morning coming through the window at that particular angle it gets in March, low and unhurried. And she'd sat there until the coffee went cold and thought about how the apartment felt different on weekends. Larger somehow. Darnell was somewhere inside it doing whatever Darnell did on Saturdays, calls probably, or the kind of paperwork that didn't leave the apartment. And his presence filled the square footage in a way that made her feel the precise dimensions of every room she wasn't in. She put on clothes and left. The record shop on Juniper Street was the kind of place that had survived 3 rounds of neighborhood reinvention by being genuinely good at the one thing it did. She'd walked past it 4 times before she ever went in. That Saturday, she just pushed the door open and let the smell of old sleeves and central heating settle around her like an exhale. She went straight to the jazz section. She always went straight to the jazz section. Her father used to play Coltrane on Sunday mornings in whatever city they were living in that year, a love supreme if he was feeling philosophical, my favorite things if he was in a lighter mood, and standing in front of a rack of jazz records was still one of the few places that felt uncomplicated to her. She found the album she was looking for near the end of the second row, reached for it at the exact moment someone else did. Their hands arrived simultaneously. She looked up. He was tall and easy in his body the way certain people are, not performing relaxation, just actually in it. Gray Henley, worn at the collar. He was looking at the album in his hand with the expression of a man genuinely weighing something, and when he looked up his face didn't do anything calculated. "My bad," he said. "You were there first."
You can have it, she said.
"What if I told you I've already heard it and I was just reaching out of habit?" She looked at him. He smiled. Not a line. Just honesty with good timing. His name was Tobias Cole. Memphis, by the way. Certain vowels surfaced when he wasn't thinking about them. He laughed right before the punchline of his own stories, just slightly, like he couldn't help it, which should have been irritating and somehow wasn't. He knew things about Coltrane's final recordings she didn't know. She knew things about the personal history behind a love supreme that surprised him. Neither of them ran out of something to say. When she finally checked her phone, she'd been in that aisle for 40 minutes. "I know," he said, when she said it out loud. "I was keeping track." She gave him her number before she decided whether she should. He texted her the next morning at 8:14. "Did you find anything else good?" She was in the burnt orange chair with her first cup of tea when it came through, and she smiled at her phone before she'd made any decision about whether to. She put it face down on the chair arm, picked it up 30 seconds later, and answered him. After that he texted every morning. Not long messages. Not complicated ones. "How are you feeling? What are you reading? Did you eat?" Small, consistent questions delivered at a reasonable hour by a man who seemed to actually want the answers. She started giving them to him. Short answers first, then longer ones, then the kind that became paragraphs without her planning them to. The calls started in the second week. Short at first, 20 minutes while she walked. Then longer. Then past 10, past 11, past midnight. Both of them talking in the low, unhurried way people talk when they've stopped performing and forgotten to start again. She told him about her father, about the way he'd moved them, her and her mother, and whatever was essential, 14 times before she turned 18, chasing work or opportunity or something he never fully named. About how she'd learned to make any room feel like hers within a week, because the alternative was spending your whole childhood feeling like a guest. About how he died before she could show him that she'd figured out how to stay somewhere. About the estate complications that followed. About the arrangement that had brought her, eventually, to this penthouse and this marriage and this guest room with its burnt orange chair and its view of a city that never fully went dark. She didn't tell him everything. Not the full shape of it. But she told him enough. That it was cold. That she had been lonelier inside this marriage than she had ever been alone, and she had spent a significant portion of her life alone. Tobias listened the way certain people listen, completely, without assembling his response while she was still talking. When she finished, he said things that were honest and not curated for comfort, which was its own kind of relief. Across the apartment, Darnell had started appearing in the kitchen in the mornings. She noticed it the third time it happened. He'd been an office-by-6 man for the entirety of their marriage, calls before the city was awake, door shut, unreachable until something in his schedule released him. But now he was sometimes just there, standing at the counter with his coffee, not on his phone, not reading anything. Just present in a way he hadn't been. She didn't remark on it. He noticed during those mornings that she made 2 cups of tea. Every morning, without variation. She drank one at the counter or carried it to her room. The second one she left on the counter until it went cold. Then she poured it out. He didn't understand it.
He didn't ask.
She was, and this part genuinely surprised her, starting to feel like herself again. Not restored, not fixed, not happy in any complete sense, but present inside her own life in a way that had been missing long enough that she'd stopped noticing the absence. It was coming back now. Quietly, in the mornings, in the burnt orange chair, in the low voice she used after midnight talking to a man from Memphis who laughed before his own punchlines and always wanted to know if she'd eaten. She was coming back.
Slowly.
She was coming back. He called Co into his office before 7. The city was still gray outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of early morning Atlanta light that hasn't committed to anything yet. Darnell was at his desk when Co came in. He didn't look up. "My wife was on the phone last night," he said.
Late.
"Find out who she's talking to." Co didn't react. He'd been given harder instructions than this in 15 years. He nodded once and left. Darnell looked at the folder open in front of him. Contracts, logistics, the kind of paperwork that kept 3 city operations running on schedule. He read the same paragraph 4 times and retained none of it. He closed the folder. He looked at the wall to his left. On the other side of that wall was the guest room.
He sat with that for a while.
Ko came back in 36 hours. He placed a manila folder on the desk and stood back without being told to. Tobias Cole, 32 years old. Memphis, Tennessee. Relocated to Atlanta 18 months prior. Jazz musician. 1 independent album. Modest critical attention. Limited commercial reach. No criminal record. No outstanding debts worth noting. No organizational affiliations of any kind. Drove a 2008 Honda Civic with a parking permit for the Old Fourth Ward. Had a dog named Pepper. Taught piano on Saturday mornings at a community center off Northside Drive, mostly to children under 12. There was a photo. A candid Tobias at some kind of outdoor event, laughing at something outside the frame, completely at ease in the way some people simply are. Darnell read the file once. Then he read it again. Weston was in the room too, positioned near the door with his hands loose at his sides and his face arranged in the expression he wore when he was waiting to be useful. He was 27 and capable and thought in straight lines, which made him effective and occasionally limited in equal measure. Say the word, Weston said. Not cruel about it. Just practical, the way he was practical about everything. Darnell didn't look up from the file. Leave, he said. Weston left. Ko stayed, because Ko understood the difference between when Darnell wanted a room empty and when he wanted one person to remain. He'd understood that distinction for 15 years without ever being told it. The silence lasted a while. Long enough that the city outside finished deciding what kind of morning it was going to be. He's nobody, Ko said finally. Not a suggestion. Not a warning. Just an observation delivered in the same tone he used for facts. I know, Darnell said. He looked at the photo again. Tobias Cole laughing at something easy in his body, taking up exactly the amount of space he needed and no more. Which means the issue isn't him. He closed the folder. He set it to the side. He sat at his desk for a long time after that, not reading anything, not making any calls, doing something he almost never did. He sat there and thought about his wife. 3 weeks passed. He gave no further instructions to his people regarding Sherry. No surveillance, no reporting. He just started being aware of her in a way he hadn't permitted himself to be before, present in the apartment in the mornings, noticing things that had apparently been true for some time without his knowledge. The burnt orange chair, for instance. He didn't know when it had arrived or how she'd gotten it upstairs. It sat in the guest room doorway at an angle that caught the morning light, and when he passed the hall he could see the impression in the cushion where she sat every night. She had built herself a corner of this apartment without mentioning it to him, without asking anything of him, and he had never noticed. He stood in the hallway one morning looking at that chair for longer than he could easily account for. She hummed while she moved through the apartment. Quiet, almost below the threshold of intention, a melody he didn't recognize. He heard it from his office one afternoon and sat very still until it faded. He called his mother in Seoul on a Wednesday. She answered on the second ring. They talked for a while about ordinary things, his aunt's health, their renovation, his cousin's new position, and he let her lead because he wasn't ready for whatever he'd called to say. Finally she stopped and simply asked, "How is Sherry?"
She's fine, he said.
A pause. Is she actually fine? Or is she fine the way you're always fine, which means you haven't looked? He closed his eyes. His mother had met Sherry once, in Seoul, 3 months after the wedding. She had pulled him aside on the second day and told him plainly that the woman was trying very hard and he was making her work for nothing. He had deflected. She had looked at him the way she always looked at him when she could see exactly what he was protecting himself from. He didn't have a good answer for the phone either. They said goodbye. He sat with the silence afterward for a long time. At 2 a.m. on a Thursday, he got up, walked down the hall, and knocked on the guest room door. 3 times. Soft and deliberate. She opened it after a moment. White shirt, bare feet, hair loose. She looked at him with the careful neutral expression she'd built over 8 months, the one that gave nothing away, the one he had taught her to build by making openness cost too much. He looked, for the first time in the 13 months she had known him, like he wasn't holding anything back. like he had set everything down somewhere before he came to the door. "I heard you laughing," he said. "I know you were happy. And I have never made you sound like that. Not once. Not in this apartment. Not in this marriage." She held the door frame. Her voice was even. She was not crying. She was precise in the way she was precise about everything that actually mattered to her, and she told him all of it. The coffee she left outside his office. The notes he never responded to. The dialect phrases she practiced alone. The 2 cups of tea every morning, one of which she had been making for him until the morning she simply stopped. The 8 months of silence while she rebuilt herself in a room he had sent her to like she was a problem he'd solved by relocating it. "You went on with your life," she said, "for 8 months, without once asking if I was okay." He said nothing for a long time. Long enough that the city outside did its quiet 3 a.m. thing, indifferent and ongoing. "You're right," he said. She waited for the bus. There wasn't one. "You're right," he said again. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, "Good night, Darnell." And she closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he sat down on the floor, back against the wall beside her door, legs out in front of him. He was not thinking about strategy. He was not thinking ahead. For possibly the first time in his adult life, he was not doing either of those things. He was just sitting on the floor of his own hallway at 2 a.m, feeling the full and specific weight of what he had done over the past 13 months. He stayed there until the light under her door went out. He didn't go back to his bedroom. He went to his office, sat at his desk, and took a legal pad from the drawer. He wrote 3 sentences. No preamble, no qualifications, no careful language designed to manage the outcome. Just 3 sentences in his handwriting, which was precise the way everything about him was precise. He tore the page off. He made coffee in the kitchen, poured a cup, carried it down the hall, and set it on the floor in front of her door with the note folded beneath the handle where she'd find it when she opened it. Then he went to his bedroom and lay on top of the covers and watched the ceiling go from dark to gray to the particular pale gold of an Atlanta morning in March. She opened the door at 7. The coffee was lukewarm. She checked, picked it up, felt it through the ceramic, and then unfolded the note. "I'd like to start over. I understand if that's not possible. I'm asking anyway." She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she took the cup and the note back inside and called Denise. Denise picked up on the second ring, which she always did for Sherry, which was the thing about Denise. Sherry told her everything. The knock, the hallway, the things she'd said and the things he hadn't defended himself against, the note on the floor. Denise listened without interrupting, without rushing toward her response the way some people do when they're assembling their opinion instead of actually listening. When Sherry finished, Denise said, "How do you feel?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." Sherry sat in the burnt orange chair with the lukewarm coffee between both palms. "I feel like it's too late," she said. "And I feel like it might not be. And I don't know how to hold both of those at the same time." "You've been holding both for months," Denise said. "You're better at it than you think." She found him in the kitchen that afternoon. Not his office, the kitchen, standing at the counter with coffee he wasn't drinking, looking out the window at the city. He turned when she came in. He looked like he hadn't slept, because he hadn't, though he'd showered and changed, and was making the effort of appearing functional. She sat down at the kitchen table, both hands flat on the surface. Not perched on the edge, not ready to leave. She sat, which meant she intended to be there for a while. She told him about Tobias Cole. All of it. She didn't apologize and she didn't soften it, and she didn't look away while she spoke. She told him that Tobias had given her back her laugh, and that was not a small thing to give a person who had been living without it. She told him, "I need you to understand how easy it is to lose someone who is trying this hard to stay." Darnell held her gaze. "I know about Tobias Cole," he said. "I've known for 3 weeks." She waited. "I told Weston there was no situation. I told him that man didn't take anything from me."
He paused.
"That I'd left it somewhere, and he picked it up. And that if I had touched him, I would have lost you completely." Another pause, shorter. "And I would have deserved it." Something shifted in her face, almost imperceptible. She called Tobias that evening from the burnt orange chair, door mostly closed, voice low. She told him everything honestly, the only way she knew how to do anything. He listened without filling the silence prematurely. When she finished, he said, "Is this what you want?"
"I don't know yet," she said.
"But I think I have to find out." A beat. "I meant what I said about the laugh," Tobias said. "You've got it back. Whatever happens, don't let anybody take it again." He knocked at 7. 3 times, the same as the night before, but different in every way that mattered. She opened the door and he was standing in the hallway with a paper bag and the particular expression of a man who had rehearsed nothing and was proceeding anyway. He'd ordered food from a Korean place on Peachtree. He told her Ko had recommended it. He told her he'd asked Ko to order something she would like. She looked at him.
"Ko doesn't know anything about what I like."
"I know," he said. "I thought it might be somewhere to start figuring that out." She stood in the doorway and considered him. This precise, sealed, complicated man holding a paper bag in his own hallway at 7 in the evening, offering her the most imperfect possible version of a gesture because it was the one he had. She considered the 13 months. She considered the note on the floor that morning, 3 sentences with no flourishes. She considered Denise saying "you're better at it than you think." Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. Not an invitation into the room, an invitation to the hallway, to the kitchen, to the apartment they technically shared and had never quite inhabited together.
"Let's see what he ordered," she said.
The guest room door stayed open that night. Not because she had moved back. Not because anything had been resolved or forgiven or rebuilt. Not because the 13 months had been accounted for or the weight of them distributed fairly between 2 people sitting at a kitchen table eating Korean food in something that was not quite comfortable and not quite unbearable. The door stayed open because a closed door had been his architecture, his solution, his management strategy, his way of organizing the disruption of her into something containable, and Sherry had spent enough of her life inside structures that weren't built for her. Darnell walked past the open door at 11 on his way to bed.
He stopped.
Looked at the room in the dark. The books lined on the windowsill, the burnt orange chair, the cold candle, the Atlanta skyline doing its patient, glittering thing beyond the glass. A room she had made entirely without him. A life she had built inside the one he'd given her, small and warm and completely hers, and he had never once asked about any of it. He understood exactly where they were. Not at the beginning of something easy. At the beginning of something true, which was harder and worth more, and which he had done nothing yet to deserve. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about the morning. He would make coffee. Both cups. He would carry hers to the guest room door and knock, and it would be the first genuinely real thing he had done in this marriage, and she would probably look at him the way people look at someone who has finally figured out something everyone else already knew. He would deserve that completely. He almost smiled. He closed his eyes. And somewhere down the hall, in a room that had been meant to diminish her and had instead become the truest place in the apartment, Sherry opened her journal to the last entry. She read it once. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a single line beneath it. She closed the journal. She set it on the window sill beside her books. She looked at the open door for a moment, the darkness of the hallway beyond it, the apartment breathing quietly around her. The line she'd written was the one thing nobody in his world, with all its reach and resources and 15-year loyalties and 2-page files assembled in 36 hours, would ever find. Because some things a woman keeps for herself.